Hello and welcome to Craftwork, a podcast by writers for writers.
Craftwork is recorded in Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, the people of the Wolastoq River. I'm Miriam Riche.
And I'm Mike Thorne, we'll be your co-hosts. The music for this podcast is composed and recorded by Randy Nichols Schroeder.
Lisa Tuttle was born and raised in Austin, Texas, and moved to Britain in the 1980s. Her first novel, Windhaven, co-written with George R.R. Martin, was followed by over a dozen fantasy, science fiction, and horror novels, including 3 recent books set in the 1890s combining crime and supernatural fiction, featuring the detective duo Jasper Jesperson and Miss Lane. The 3rd volume, The Curious Affair of the Missing Mummies, was published last year. She has also written hundreds of award-winning short stories collected in several volumes, including A Nest of Nightmares, The Dead Hours of Night, and most recently, Riding the Nightmare. She is the author of the Encyclopedia of Feminism and currently writes a monthly science fiction review column for The Guardian. She lives with her husband and their daughter in Scotland.
We're very, very excited to have Lisa Tuttle on our podcast today. A major presence in this world of dark fiction, and actually I'd say speculative fiction more largely. It's difficult to classify Lisa Tuttle's work because it's doing so many different things and working in so many different spaces. Thank you so much, Lisa, for sitting down to talk with us.
You're welcome.
I watched recently an interview you did with Annie's Bookstop of Worcester. And in that interview, you described your stories as often featuring strange events and inexplicable happenings. What draws you to the fantastic and the weird as opposed to realism as a writer?
Ever since I was reading as a child, I was drawn to fantasies and fairy tales. And once I was sort of in my early teens, I discovered science fiction. Back in those days, actually, I think science fiction was kind of the dominant genre. And the whole idea of fantasy as being written for adult didn't start until sort of late 60s, early 70s. So gradually, fantasy kind of took over. And horror, in fact, at first I used to dislike that as a label, because although some of my stories are definitely horror stories, I think they're more often in the kind of strange or weird. And of course, now a lot of people are interested in weird fiction and strange tales, and ghost stories were probably my favorite when I was young, of all the things that I read. And my father had several enormous compilations of ghost stories, weird tales. I've read Lovecraft and M.R. James and Edith Wharton, so many of the kind of classic writers. That was what I was sort of drawn to as when I was writing, because I started writing very young. I was still at school. I didn't want to write kind of ordinary stories about people having, in fact, I remember my idea of grown-up books being kind of about really dull stuff, So what attracted me was, I guess, this feeling of anything could happen. I've also always preferred stories that are they're sort of based in the real world, rather than being a secondary universe. I mean, there's some great work of those type of fantasies, but just my personal inclination was, I suppose that was why, I liked ghost stories, a sort of eruption of the impossible, or the supposedly impossible, or the strange, or the inexplicable, into a world you thought you knew, whether it was suburban Houston, or whether it was London. And I still have that preference, which was why I kind of was an uneasy fit with what was considered science fiction, because if it has to be in the far future or set on a spaceship or another planet, it was more difficult for me. So I tried, because I wanted to sell my stories, to write what I thought I could sell, but I would always be drawn back to these strange stories.
I definitely see that in the work of yours. I've read this kind of uncanny shimmering, and I'm curious because as you're describing your own interest in this kind of betweenness, it makes me think of Amy Gentry's NYRB Introduction to My Death, wherein you said your writing is a kind of realism where something other breaks through. Gentry described Shirley Jackson as sort of your spiritual godmother. Shirley Jackson, you don't quite know what's madness and what's supernatural. And so I was wondering if that comparison that she made between you and Shirley Jackson resonates with you. Is Jackson an influence of yours? And if so, are there any specific books or stories of hers that you've responded to?
Oh, yes. Yes. The Haunting of Hill House was, one of the major books for me. And her short stories, things like, well, of course, The Lottery is the one everyone knows. And it's been years since I've gone back and reread all of her short stories. But every time I read something of hers or reread it, it's, in fact, what was the one? It's really about a girl going off to college. Yeah. I read something about it and I thought, oh, I don't have that book. And I don't think I ever read it, when I was younger. So I got it on Kindle and I started reading it. I thought, this is fantastic. I mean, if I had read it in my, say, late teens or early 20s, I think it would have been a huge influence on me. But it can't really be a retrospective influence. I've read 2 biographies of her as well, of Shirley Jackson, just out of curiosity, for how other writers work, particularly for a writer that I always did feel a kind of connection to her. To Joyce Carol Oates is another one. I mean, we're different, obviously, but yes, Shirley Jackson was certainly a big influence. I mean, it's great that she's finally getting the kind of attention that I think she always deserved.
Certainly. We both just recently read the Ruth Franklin biography of her, which I thought was a superb piece of work.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned Joyce Carol Oates as well, because I read an interview with the Horror Writers Association where you described her as your literary idol. Miriam and I are both huge admirers of Joyce Carol Oates as well.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to overstate how much she's contributed not only to dark fiction, but just to American
fiction.
Yeah, exactly.
American literature. Absolutely.
Yes, certainly. Yeah. So that really struck me as interesting that she was a major influence on you. And I was curious, what is it about Joyce Carol Oates' work that speaks to you? And if there are specific books of hers as well that had an influence.
Well, I realize how many books of hers I still haven't read that I want to, because she's written so much. What began it was she seemed to me to be in the mode of realist American fiction that was not my interest. But I read, I can't remember, what was it? They, I think, was a novel of hers. And I read By the North Gate or something. I can't remember what it was called. But her short stories, I have this collection, The Wheel of Love, which is kind of like one of my major books. Like, there are just certain books you always keep. I've got to have a copy of The Haunting of Hill House. I have to have a copy of The Wheel of Love. And that wasn't one of her supernatural ones, but the stories in it, there just something about the psychology and about the tone. It just really struck me. And when I went off to college, I went to Syracuse University, and my advisor had been her advisor. And this was like this, you have to tell me about Joyce Carol Oates. What was she like? And it's funny because when I finally met her for the first time, we were at the Ghost Story Festival in Dublin. And I did an onstage interview with her when we were first just sort of chatting and we were going for a walk or something. And I told her that Dr. Dyke had been my advisor. She's going, oh, I can't believe it. She was kind of just blown away by this kind of weird connection. And that's nothing to do with literature, really. It's just, they're just some writers. You sort of feel this connection. You want this connection. And it was so lovely to meet her and actually find that she's a really funny, down-to-earth person. I mean, the impression you get of her, and certainly that I did back in the 70s, anytime there was an interview with, I think it was in the New York Times book review section, they called her the dark lady of American fiction or something like that. She would often come across as if she were either slightly mad or, very, very strange. But I think it was this kind of, I think it was 2 things. One of it, I think, was quite often she was maybe intellectually beyond the interviewer or was teasing them. And then another, you kind of get pushed into this kind of presenting a certain front. And because a lot of what she would write about would be about kind of damaged, nervous, psychologically troubled people. People sometimes, it's very odd, but I mean, because some of my stories were horror stories or whatever, I'd meet someone and they'd go, oh, but you seem so normal. How do you write these stories? And I think this is such a weird perception. And yet it's also kind of catered to by things like Murder, She Wrote, where you have someone who writes crime stories and she also solves crimes and keeps stumbling across mysteries. And so there is this idea that if you're writing about, and I think women, this is often something that affects women even more than men, because at least in the past, men were the kind of, avatars of fiction, and the great American writer would be a man. And women maybe they were a bit odd, if they wanted to have a literary life. And so it was often assumed that they must be writing out of their personal experience. For instance, a writer like Sylvia Plath and Sexton, they wrote confessional poetry, as did Robert Lowell. That's often then assumed, and of course, Sylvia Plath's only novel was based on her own experiences, particularly in the days when serious literature was about real life. I think maybe there was a tendency to assume the writer was like one of her characters, particularly if it was in the first person. Of course, writers always draw on their own lives, I think there must be very few writers who don't. But that doesn't mean you're writing that is your personality right there on the page. So I don't know, I've kind of gone down into a strange little cul-de-sac there.
Oh, no, not at all. What you say is entirely relatable. I was reading the introduction to Writing the Nightmare, and I think you said that the only things worth writing about are sex and death. Mike and I are both writers. We both write dark fiction. There is this assumption that, I don't know, some people are surprised that we're so normal, I suppose. But the interesting things to write about are, I don't know, I guess sex, death, things that are kind of transgressive, but it doesn't necessarily mean,
yes,
totally.
Actually, it's important things and also unusual things and strange things and psychological things, but it doesn't mean you are, writing isn't necessarily therapy. You're not pouring your problems out on the page to deal with them. I don't know. People do have different ideas of writing, and particularly if they don't write themselves, I think, or they don't write fiction. And so if the only writing you've done is letters or journalism or maybe diary entries, maybe you do see fiction as it has to come from the same place as these actual events and, your own personal feelings. And also the idea that I would be this laughing, happy person who could then write, terrifying stories.
I know that you started out as a journalist. When I read My Death, I was thinking of, and I could be wrong, but I think you had posted something somewhere on social media in which you had recently read a biography of X by Catherine Lacey.
I haven't read that yet.
Okay.
It's right on my to-be-read pile when I've got time.
Oh, you must have posted your to-be-read pile. I just thought it was interesting. I listened to an interview with her where she said that she wanted to write a biography. Her agent said basically like, good luck. It's really hard to write a biography. So she wrote this fake biography, which is kind of what My Death is. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe there's no connection, but just where you had that kind of nonfiction background, did that in any way feed into your conception of My Death? What kind of things were you influenced by when you wrote that?
Well, first, I'm just going to take up the point of saying I started out as a journalist. It's true, I had a job as a journalist. But prior to that, I'd already sold several short stories. When I went to university, my plan was, I don't know how I understood that it was hard to make a living as a writer of fiction, but from somewhere I did get this idea that I would probably have to do something else. And I didn't want to teach, that's a kind of common thing that women did in particular. I didn't want to be a teacher, and I was interested in journalism as well, and travel writing and kind of explorers, I guess, when I was younger. So I started thinking, what could I do? And while I was in high school, I was on the high school paper. I mean, I also submitted some stories to the magazine, but they weren't picked up. They weren't chosen. And I was already writing short stories and trying to sell them, when I was in my teens. So when I got my first job, I just wanted something that I could do to earn enough money to pay the bills, and that I could then be working on a book or short stories, whatever. It took me a long time to be ready to write a novel. And I certainly by then knew you couldn't make a living as a short story writer, or very few people could. So I was just looking for a job. I went down to the Texas Employment Commission in Austin, and one of the jobs that was being advertised was for a typist, copy typist at the newspaper. And I thought, oh, daily newspaper, that'd be fun. I'd love to work on a daily newspaper. I can type. I had a really good speed. I'd taken a typing course in high school, despite being advised against it by the careers advisor or whatever. You don't want to learn. I do want to learn how to type, but you'll just end up with a secretarial job. No, I won't. I will write my stories. And I can do it much faster when I've learned how to type. Anyway, it wasn't a college level course, but I did know how to type, and I could type very fast. And I hadn't really worked except like doing babysitting and things like that. The person I put down as a reference, they wanted you had to have a couple of references. So Harlan Ellison, he'd been my mentor at Clarion. And in fact, he'd let me stay in his house, and I'd been his house sitter for 1 month, watering the plants, and I could just send out orders for, milk and cheese and stuff like that and live off that. So anyway, so I put down Harlan Ellison as my reference. And it turned out that the man in charge of hiring was a big science fiction fan. And so he called in and he's interviewing, well, you've got great, I had to take a typing test. Well, your typing test is excellent. I'll tell you that. He said, but can I just ask you one thing? How do you know Harlan Ellison? So anyway, when he learned that, and not only that, word got around, oh, she's had a few short stories published, science fiction stories. So while my actual job, and I was warned, this is not a career path or whatever they said, you won't become a journalist. We just want typists. The journalists have just come out of J school at University of Texas, and they do part-time typing, part-time reporting. But, no chance. I said, I don't care. I just want a job, In fact, it was an evening job, so I could sleep late in the morning. It was great. And I still had 2 days a week off. But word got around, and so there was some science fiction movie. I can't even remember what it was now. And they said, hey, Lisa, would you like to write a review of this movie? You like science fiction? So I said, do I get paid? And they said, yes, you'll get paid for a regular day's work. You just go off and see the movie and charge us for the ticket, and, we'll give it back to you. And then as long as you can just spend the rest of the day writing your review. Perfect. So anyway, I did a few things like that, and then I worked my way up. So I was like an entertainment journalist anyway. So my feeling is, yes, it has affected my writing. I think it probably has made me more concise, maybe. I don't easily expand out. And of course, if you're writing a novel, a certain amount of expansion is usually, kind of appreciated. Who was it? Was it Hemingway was a taker-outer, and was it Thomas Wolfe, or maybe it was Fitzgerald, was a putter-inner. There was one of them said something about that. And I thought, yeah, I'm the taker-outer. I go and edit and I take out excess words and, try and get it across. But at the same time, I was already a fiction writer, and thinking in that way. And I do like reading biographies. I remember going out when I was living in London, and I was trying to think, what will I do next? And I had lunch with someone she was an editor, but she'd also written a biography or something. And she was saying, and I said, well, I kind of like the idea of writing a biography. I mean, one person that I did think of at the time, but someone else beat me to it, was E. Nesbit, the children's writer, because she had a fascinating life and she knew everybody. But anyway, this editor told me, well, if you want to do a biography, what you have to do, it's either got to be the first biography of this person, and that will probably be someone who's recently died, or someone who for some reason it's suddenly become of interest. You can't take a really obscure person and just be the first. It's not going to sell unless to a very small academic press or market. Or you write the new biography of someone who is of perpetual interest, like Dickens or Queen Elizabeth or something like that. So I kind of thought, oh, well, that kind of lets me out. I don't know and what I'd do. I am interested in biography. The biography of X, I've just read a review of it that made me think I have to read this book. It just sounds like something to be right up my alley. In my death, I really was aiming to make these these invented people seem like real people by using things like, her books were reprinted by Virago, or putting them into a context with other real people of the time. And borrowing details from some of their lives. Of course, I did do that.
You mentioned a few things just now that are very interesting to me. I'm wondering if I can tie both of these into one question. The first part of my question, they might not be directly related, but the first part is if you remember any specific tidbits of wisdom that Harlan Ellison shared And the second part of my question is, I really like that idea of putter inner versus taker outer. I can really see that in your fiction. There is a kind of concision and clarity and focus. I was just finishing A Nest of Nightmares last night. There's a tightness to the stories and an economy of language that's very noticeable and impressive.
Well, the first part, okay, Harlan. I mean, one thing that comes to mind is that he went through a short story of mine once. He said, "This is very good, but let me show you how you can make it better." And he just went through with a pencil and either circled or underlined things where they were maybe rather not quite cliches, but your kind of standard. What these days, what are these little programs that anticipates what you're going to say would do, or where a sharpen the verb. Don't just use a kind of ordinary. Maybe if you repeat a word, do it for a purpose rather than, just you've not been paying attention to your own writing. And that was hugely valuable. That's the sort of thing a good editor can do. But it was particularly having it be another writer, and a writer who I admired. Just going through it, it wasn't a teacher and it wasn't just an editor. He could be a bit extreme. It was like you just, drop out of college and just write. I mean, that's what very upset my parents a great deal that I could even consider it. Also, reading lists. I mean, they weren't lists, but there would just be some book that he thought, "Oh, have you ever read this?" And all these writers I'd never heard of. A lot of the writers that I came across when I was at Clarion, the writers' workshop, they were often genre writers. So they weren't things I would have learned about, at school or college. I hadn't read many, I guess, detective stories at that point, maybe. So discovering Raymond Chandler and people like that. Frederick Prokhosh is one writer I remember. It didn't really resonate with me, but if he said you should read this, I would read it. And also just his importance, just kind of stressing the importance of writing. You're going to be a writer, you don't sit around and talk about what you're going to write. And it isn't enough to just like make notes or whatever. You've got to be writing. And of course, Harlan himself was both a good and a bad example, because he was always kind of behind deadline and talking about this great idea he had that he was going to write. I think people are talking about him now as having bipolar, or at least had some element of that, which when I think about it, when I would see him, he'd have these up times, kind of manic. And then other times when it was like he couldn't get out of his bathrobe. All these little distracting things, which, it's even easier to distract yourself now if you've got, the internet. But with Harlan, instead, he would phone someone up, like there would be a question that would arise that these days we'd ask Google. And in those days, it was like, "I'll call Isaac," meaning Asimov, or "I'll call Ray," meaning Ray Bradbury, depending on what the subject was. I can't think of any very specific things because he also recognized that different people have their own, ways of working, and what works for one writer doesn't work for another. But the importance was you must work. You have to sit down and write.
I remember an interview you mentioned that rewriting is your favorite part of the process. Do you still find moments of discovery in the rewriting? What is it about rewriting that appeals to you, I guess?
Now, Harlan was very notorious, I think, for claiming he didn't rewrite. And I think it probably was true. And that's probably why there was a lot of those delaying tactics, because he wasn't quite ready to do it. The reason I prefer rewriting to writing is because, writing, it's like there's nothing there. You're having to produce it out of nowhere, out of a few little vague ideas. And maybe this idea fits with this idea, but how? And so it's just this struggle. And it just feels like such hard work because you're producing the material from which you're going to make your statue. But once you've made a statue, no matter how clumsy it is, it's this sort of clay figure, with a big bulby head and stupid looking ears and, it's completely wrong shape. But there it is. You've made the clay. Particularly when I was younger, I think the rewriting would really be just going through it and refining, it would be the same beginning and the same end. More and more now, I sometimes find that I've just taken the completely wrong start. Like, I've just recently decided about a particular story, which I had a draft of. I showed the first few pages to, I was at a sort of very, very laid back kind of writers conference with some other writers just before the Worldcon in Glasgow. And we all brought along some little bit or talked about what we were writing just to kind of get a little bit of feedback. And I don't know, no one said anything about the point of view or the tone, but afterwards, I was thinking and thinking, and I thought, no, I got it wrong. I wrote it in the first person, and I need a different perspective on the story, because I'm also seeing it as something that it's probably going to be a novella, and it just needs, I don't know, it's hard to describe it, but it can't be stuck in one person's head where they're telling you, this is what happened to me, and then this happened, and then this happened. I have to get sort of a wider view on it. The other thing is that about working on a computer, it's so different. I mean, it used to be you would have to get the draft, and then there would all be on paper. And I mean, occasionally, I suppose I would start over something, but now I rewrite every day. It's like, if this is a good beginning, then I'm going to make it better, so I start changing around, fiddling around. So it probably takes me longer in a way to write, but it just is good to finally have some sort of a draft, however good I think it is or however bad I think it is, because then I start over. Then I'm not just picking it about. I've printed it out so I can read it on a page instead of on a screen. And then I sit down and start over from the beginning. And in the case of the one I'm talking about, the novella, maybe even a novel, is that possible? A very short novel. I'm going to start in a different place. And I already know what my first scene is going to be, which is nowhere in the story. Well, it's a sort of dream, actually, as much as a scene. And I had that image right from the beginning of writing the story, but then I thought, it doesn't fit, And now I thought, no, I'm starting with that image. Now I can do it. It's not in the first person. My best thing to say about rewriting is, and every day, and you feel like you're constantly improving it. Whereas in the first draft, when you're still writing it, you don't know if you just made a terrible mistake. And I've also found that sometimes when I'm finding it really hard to progress with something, is I've finally recognized that I'm trying to push it before I'm ready. I haven't figured out what I want to do, so I have to think about it more. I took a drawing class, an evening class, a few years back. I don't know, maybe it was before COVID, so I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, because I've never really learned to draw, and I thought it would be nice and it's something to do. And the first thing, the thing the teacher said to me several times was, you're too impatient. You have to do the work first before you don't just start drawing it. Look at the thing you're trying to draw. You might need to sketch it out, put little points on the paper, if it's a face, say where the eyes go, and then you can erase all that, when you're drawing. I thought, that's what it is. I'm impatient. I want to get started on this story. I've got this idea. I want to get started. But what happens is that at some point I come up against something and it's just like, I make myself keep going. And I realized, those last 2 pages are just terrible. And I just need to think about this more. And I need to plan a little more, because I've never been one for great outlining or detailed planning. It's just more get a shape of what I want.
It's fascinating to hear about your process. I'm curious to know where a piece starts for you. Does it generally start with a specific character or set of characters? Is it a concept that usually activates you? Maybe an image, some combination? Probably it varies from piece to piece.
It's usually, I would say, a situation. It's not a character. It's a character who may be very, very vague, but it is someone in a situation. And sometimes it's a concept as well. I mean, that's sort of, I guess, the science fiction or speculative fiction aspect. So it's either a situation like, I don't want to give an idea, because I know I just had an idea like in the shower or something, where I was thinking about this sort of, I thought there's got to be flash fiction though, but it was definitely a science fictional thing. And it was a sort of future where everything was very streamlined and everybody had their little printer. They had a printer that could print stuff, 3D. In fact, this is weird. I remember when I was still working in the public library, and every public library in the system was going to get a 3D printer. And I remember talking to the other people that work there, like, what is this for? Why do we need one? What's good? But this was this big idea. I don't think it ever happened, but I'm still not sure why they thought this was. I mean, plenty of science fiction writers have done this already, where, you've got this near future or far future, and they just kind of, you print out the stuff you need. Your printer on Mars builds your house for you or whatever. I don't know. I just had an idea about someone where that's basically how they get everything they need, and then it breaks. And so The whole supply chain revolves around everyone already having a printer at home. So how do you get the actual printer if it stops working? Then you go from whatever your situation is to the people. I'm sure I read this in some book about writing years ago, but it's the person who was hurt the most by this. That's the obvious person to make a good dramatic story, is whatever the situation is, whether it's that, I don't know, people are becoming zombies, or someone's, machine that they need to live by has broken down. Whatever it is, you've got to have someone that's going to have a unique, not necessarily unique, but it has to be very important to them. And it's good also if it's sort of not the first person you'd think of. It wouldn't necessarily be the kind of, hero of a movie or what, that it's going to be someone, maybe someone who isn't normally seen as being of that much interest, but you put them in a very sticky situation. And then maybe they have, not only are they especially affected by it, but it turns out they have some particular idea, connection, character flaw that makes them able to deal with it, or they're destroyed by it because they're not normal, I don't know, because they can't cope with it. So I would say basically it's situation. Sometimes it's an image too, but it's more like an idea. But I mean, it can be something like seeing a picture, a painting, something, the novella I'm talking about, actually the sort of image that sort of somehow led to it was, I don't want to say what it is because it's too connected to the unwritten thing, but it could be a painting or sometimes I buy postcards because they have really unusual, images on them, and then I sort of stick them up around the room. And this one was one of the symbolists, I think, and it's just kind of this woman in a sort of veil. I think she's wearing a necklace and she's kind of like holding it. And it's got some title like Silence or something, I don't know. But there was just something about that image that I just sort of liked. Often two things will come together, because I do always write things down in notebooks, because if you don't write them down, you forget them. And I'll tell you what's depressing too, is sometimes to come across an old notebook and to realize I had that idea in 2007 and I only wrote it last year. What took me so long? But sometimes you get this little idea, and I would sort of write some little note to myself. And then a little while later, could be soon after, could be a month later, whatever, I have something else and I make that note. And then one day I'm kind of looking through my notes and I go, oh, put that one with that one.
Your narratives often feature what I might call like a kind of radical empathy, where you do draw on uncanny and supernatural elements to explore the idea of what it might be like to literally experience another person's subjectivity. And I find this interesting because, in a sense, that's what writing is. It's getting to spend time in another person's mind. Is this dynamic something you're conscious of in your writing?
Certainly, there are themes or ideas that I keep getting drawn back to again and again. And I suppose one of them is, how do we, in fact, again, this novella I'm wanting to write, I'm wanting to totally rewrite. A large part of it is, it's about how impossible it is to be certain you've understood another person, or that you know what they're feeling, that you think you do, or you sort of fool yourself that you do. But then they do something that is so, to your mind, out of character, or they try and explain something they've done in a way that you can't make sense of. A lot of my stories have been about, relationships, like a relationship that breaks up. In this particular what I'm working on, I mean, the main character has split up with someone, and it's sort of about getting a different perspective on him, I suppose, but also connecting to someone else. I mean, I keep feeling like the puzzle of this story is about, I mean, it's the old question of how do you know that what I look at when I say blue and what you call blue is the same? However well you think you communicate with someone else, there's basically a mystery kind of at the heart of them. And it's on both sides. And yet it's one of those mysteries that we keep trying to solve, certainly to get close to another person, and you want to know them. And then the little shock of, if you start off, if you want to do psychologically, with the baby, apparently babies don't even recognize their mothers. They don't get upset when their mother goes out of the room until they're, I forget what age it is, 6 months or 8 months or something like that. Because basically, as long as there's another human being, they'll be just as happy, if that person comes and smiles at them and picks them up. But once they've reached that age of actually they know who their mummy is, and then this stranger is picking them up and they go, yeah! The kind of recognizing. I mean, I even have a line, it's one of my favorite lines actually in My Death. And it is based on a dream I had, a nightmare I had as a child, where she dreams about this little clown doll. And then she's telling her mother why her nightmare disturbed her so much. And her mother's going, but you love that little doll. That doll's not scary. She said, no, it was scary. It was scary. She meant in the dream, it was scary. And what makes her cry isn't because the dream was so frightening, but because her mother doesn't understand. Because her mother didn't have the dream. Their mother didn't see it. Their mother could just see this little puppet thing, this funny little doll. And she says something like, this little doll once loved me so much I could bite its nose off. Then the next time it woke me up screaming from a dream or something. I mean, it was the disconnect, between your perceptions. I mean, that's not even a person, it's just a toy, but toys to children have personalities and feel like people. So I guess that's one of the things that I write about.
I have My Death right here. It was, once it had loved me enough to let me eat its nose, now it would make me wake up screaming. I really loved that part of the book. It was very uncanny.
You mentioned another recurring thematic fixation, this idea of broken or troubled relationships. I was revisiting your novel, Familiar Spirit, your debut solo authored novel. And Nest of Nightmares also has a lot of stories that grapple with this idea. And in both, you kind of enmesh the idea of a broken or troubled relationship with supernatural disturbances. I liked the way you used supernatural possession and Familiar Spirit to kind of grapple with this idea. Valancourt recently reissued these two books. You've had a long career as a writer. Do you often go back and look at your early work? Is that something you prefer not to do? And are there any ways in which you've noticed your process has changed over time, or has it more or less stayed the same?
I'm sure it must have changed. About my old work, the times I tend to read it again is if it's going to be reprinted. When I've put together new collections or when old collections have been reprinted, of course, I've read them all again and resisted the urge to rewrite. But actually, sometimes I read something and go, oh, that's really good. And I was only 19 when I wrote that. But I don't know. I recently saw someone put something on social media about what was nominated for and what won the Nebula Awards, kind of year by year. And there was one year, sometime in the 70s, I don't remember now, and there was a story of mine. And I'm going, oh, was it nominated for the Nebula? Oh, I didn't even remember that. And then I'm going, what is that story even about? I sort of remember the title, and it was just really weird. It's never been reprinted. It was wherever it was printed. I don't remember. Oh, I think it was Amazing Stories, probably a pulp magazine. And so I know I have it around the house somewhere. Well, in a loft, in a box, which I don't feel like going and looking for it. So I contacted the archivist at Texas A&M at the library there, where they've got my stuff. I don't know, a lot of my publications. And I said, could you find this story and just like scan it for me and send it to me? And he did. And so I looked at it and I started reading it. I read the first page. I just got so embarrassed. I don't know why. I just thought, oh, I don't think I can read this story. So I'm going to go back and read it. Maybe I'm being unfair. It was a kind of, post-apocalypse kind of story. Everybody's miserable and it's this sort of horrible world. And women are sort of constantly having to find somebody they can trade sex to get, like a piece of meat or something that they can cook for dinner. Anyway, I just read the first page and I thought, ugh. And then I looked up my kind of details about it and I realized, oh yeah, I wrote it when I was at college. I was like 19 or 20 and I sort of sold it to somebody, and then that, whatever it was either an anthology or a magazine, tanked. So I got it back after about a year or a year and a half. And so I sent it to somebody else and they rejected it. And then I sent it to somebody else. Anyway, eventually it turned up in Amazing Stories. And I can't believe it got nominated for a Nebula. I honestly can't. But I guess maybe I should read the whole thing before I judge it so harshly. But I mean, I obviously decided not to include it in one of my first two anthologies, or third anthology even. I mean, collection. So I don't know. So yes, so it's, sometimes I read a story that I wrote a long time ago and I go, ugh. And other times I read it and I go, wow, this is really pretty good.
That's a pretty ubiquitous experience. We are our own harshest critics. It's interesting you're mentioning writing around the age of 19 or 20. I know that you kind of came up during a time when sci-fi, fantasy, and horror were all classed together well outside the mainstream. And I'm wondering, did you have any problems with this, or did it affect your approach to material at all?
Well, I do remember I used to, if I wrote something and I thought was good, I would try and sell it to mainstream markets, and nobody ever, they never bit. And the other thing, it was a problem that most of what I was writing were sort of strange stories or horror, and that wasn't really, I would send stories off and they wanted science fiction, so it was kind of difficult. So if I didn't sell it to the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, it was kind of rough going. I mean, I just had to kind of write what I could write, what I knew about. I mean, I did occasionally try to write more mainstream stories, but they were pretty dull, So my best bet, I figured, was just to stick with what I wanted to write, and also to try and write a novel. I mean, I did start a couple of novels that didn't. When I wrote Familiar Spirit, that was actually a very long short story, and I sent it off to Charles Grant because I'd been trying to sell him a story, and he said, oh, I really want to buy a story from you, but this one is not it, because he said, I was going to say it's way too long, because it was probably about 9,000 words or something. He said, but then I realized, no, it actually isn't long enough. He said, the things you're dealing with, you can't really do in a short story, and I think you really ought to look at this again, and it might even be a novel. And so it was like, oh, you mean I have an idea for a novel? Wow. So I put aside the kind of science fiction novel I'd been trying to write, which was a really bad first attempt at what later became Lost Futures, which I was able to finally kind of deal with what I wanted to write. So anyway, so that was how that novel came about. And what you were saying earlier about outlines or not, I have to admit, I am now at a point where I realized I do need some of an outline, particularly in a novel. In a short story, not really. But in a novel, I may start off with just a kind of open-ended. But if I keep that end too open, I end up with another unfinished novel. I have to really give it some thought and then start writing, rough idea of it's going to go this, and this is where I want it, the sort of general area where I want it to end. And that works better for me. I mean, I don't like to overly outline things and put too much detail in. But I guess once I've sort of got a start on it, where I've got the feeling of the characters and what the opening situation is, then I feel then I have to do that work of kind of trying to do some plotting and figure out where I'm going.
It's interesting to hear the ways in which your process has changed over time. And it's also fascinating to hear that Lost Futures started in a different form much earlier. I think I mentioned to you that's one of my favorite works of yours. It's and that was published with the Del Abyss line in the 90s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was published more as a science fiction novel in the UK. And it was actually up for the Arthur C. Clarke Award. Amazing.
Fascinating. Well, it is genre slippery.
Exactly. I mean, you can see the kind of horrific elements in it, but equally, it's got a science fictional idea.
Yes.
The multiverse, which wasn't used quite as often in those days. It was a little bit earlier. In fact, at the Worldcon, I heard people were talking about the multiverse, and they were mentioning several novels. And I muttered to my friend who was with me, I said, yes, and I wrote about it back in the 1990s. But, yeah.
Yeah, it's a wonderful novel. You were just talking about the role of science fiction in that novel. Your first book was co-authored with George R.R. Martin, Windhaven, and that's a science fiction novel. You've also written children's books. Cat Witch is a very beautiful and sophisticated children's book. So I guess this is a kind of an overarching question about your collaborative process. I imagine it would be different between these two very different books, but what is your collaborative process like when you're writing, say, Windhaven with George R.R. Martin, and then in something like Catwitch, does it begin with images and then the text responds to the images, or do you write and then the illustrator?
No, Catwitch was very different because
Okay.
Windhaven was George and I getting together and wanting to write a story together. Well, I began it actually and then mailed it off to him, and then he added more, and then we talked about it. It was co-written. Whereas with Catwitch, Una was doing these paintings, and she had a publisher who had done another book of her paintings. She wrote a sort of text to explain the story because she had the story in her mind, and that was what the pictures were all about. And she basically said to the editor, well, you can edit it. And the editor obviously felt, no, this wasn't going to really be quite right. So I was then invited to, could I write the text that would go with the story? Well, I knew the story from Una. It was her story, but it wasn't really a publishable, I guess, for a book. It did have the bones of the story. We talked. I saw her paintings, the ones that she'd finished, and saw the sketches or whatever she had for the ones she was going to do. And then I wrote the story. I talked to her about the character of the cat, Jules, and the witch, and who was a bit based on her. And so I wrote it. That was a very different collaboration, really, because it was her story that she had painted, and I was then putting it into words, I guess, writing it in a way that worked as a story. Yeah, a lot of people love it, but I'm sure it's mainly for the pictures. Well, I mean, the story is nice, but
I love that there's an Edmund Spencer reference in a children's book.
well, these books are as much aimed at adults, really. I mean, the publisher was not really a children's book publisher, although they did some other books that I wrote the texts for. Well, one was very adult. It was like just some paintings. And I think there was some reason they would meet these artists and they'd want to do books with the artists, but then they'd need some sort of story to hang the pictures on. But this other book, I don't think the painter had any particular story in mind. He just had these different pictures of, a lot of times it was a female figure walking through different kind of landscapes and things like that. And so I just came up with a kind of rather, I guess, episodic. I was striving for a kind of poetic quality. Not many people probably even saw the book, but they just couldn't do just pictures. You had to have something. They also did these like children's literary houses with Rosalind Ash. Each one was about a different children's book and had a different artist. All these long ago things.
Well, I mean, you're prolific. You've got a large body of work. We've been talking a lot about process. I'm curious how regimented you are as a writer. Do you stick to a consistent schedule or routine? Does it vary? Does it shift?
I feel I've got worse as years have gone by. What I like is if I've got the morning clear and I can just come upstairs, sit down and write. And then write emails or look at the internet in the afternoon after lunch. And then it used to be I would then also quite often like to write in the evening, but I haven't really done that for a while, or it's quite rare now. The only time I think I was very regimented was when my daughter was really young, and it was like, okay, I've got 2 hours while she's with the childminder. Okay, I have to write, or school, until I have to go pick her up from school, or she comes home on the bus, or. So that's probably when I was the most organized. Not so much now.
As you're speaking about being regimented or unregimented, we recently had a lot of friends and family in town. And, sometimes when you try to prioritize your writing over your life, you're like, what am I doing? Like, I don't know, or at least that's how I feel, because it takes a long time to write. And I wanted to bring up a quote from My Death. Now, I know this is your protagonist speaking and not you, but your protagonist says, quote, publishers might fail me, readers lose interest, but that story itself let me down was something that had never occurred before, unquote. The publishing world can be pretty brutal and discouraging at times, but we are always trying to hang on to the pure pleasure of writing and spending time with our imagination. So is writing still something that's like fun for you?
Yeah, when it works. Sometimes the struggle, particularly in the first draft, is to feel, is this any good? And there have been times in the past where I've tried to stick to, I must write at least, 1,000 words, 2,000 words, whatever. back in the 80s, I remember keeping a little diary where I would write how many words I wrote in a day. Well, I wouldn't put myself through that again anymore. But the thing is, when you break through, what's wonderful, it is a wonderful feeling when you feel like you've discovered something, or you break through and you've been just in the story in the same way you can be when you're reading something wonderful, Larry McMurtry often wrote about the conflict between reading and writing because he loved both. But if he was spending too much time reading, he didn't write, and then there is that slight worry about other people's voices kind of getting into your head, and you want to be thinking about your own voice and what it is you want to say. But when it happens, it's so good that you think, why do I even let it get away from me? It's like you can't necessarily write every single day. I mean, I do know people who do write every day, even on holiday, and it's like they always have to get up and, it's like people who have to have their morning run, or which I have never done, or something. But there is a joy in it. And really, I think if there is no joy in it, then why go on doing it? Unless, of course, you're being paid a lot of money. Or you have to desperately, to survive, and you're hoping to do it. But it doesn't mean it's joyful all the time. There are times when it's painful or boring. And of course, you don't want to feel like if you're feeling bored, you're going to think, well, why is the reader going to enjoy it? But basically, yes, it comes down to there's more than just trying to write something that you can sell. There is the just writing and entertaining yourself, and having that feeling. That's why we do it, I think, really.
Oh, certainly. It's one of the best feelings in the world. Just yesterday, Mike and we took my father to see the new Alien film. But before then, I was working on my short story, and Mike was teasing me, my posture. I was standing at my desk, like just trying to get a few more words in. And he was like, oh, you look like someone who's like, just a little bit more before we have to go. And that's because it can be so fun and so immersive. And you brought up something interesting just now. Balancing reading and writing, trying to make sure to hold on to your own voice. For example, right now I'm reading Nabokov. I have no interest in writing I love him, but if I try to write like him, it's just not going to work. And so I try to block that out. How does the protagonist of a work affect your approach to style and voice?
I think it's less that the protagonist affects me, more that what is the story? What's the best way to tell it, I suppose. Of course, sometimes there is an issue if it is in first person. And there's just something I wrote some years back where I suddenly realized I gave up on it. I realized the main character, who was meant to be a young woman, was talking like me, like she was, this was, kind of back when maybe just pre-smartphone or something like that, or maybe when they just started, and it was still very, very new to me. And I'm thinking, oh, come on. I suddenly realized this is stupid. I certainly can't be inside her head. It's the wrong age. And the main viewpoint character of the thing I'm working on is quite young. And actually, that's another reason not to do it in first person, because I'm thinking this is a young American woman, and I will get it wrong. I mean, actually, someone had pointed out some phrase I use. He said it makes it sound really old-fashioned. And I do want to set it in it's basically now, or maybe even, a couple of years in the future. So I think that is another good reason to put it in third person. I mean, sometimes I don't even think about the question of why is this person telling the story, but sometimes I do. And then sometimes it's a question that, well, I'm glad you asked. Would they really tell this story? And would they tell it in this way?
Atmosphere and environment play a significant role in much of your fiction. You were born in Texas. You now live in Scotland. I believe you lived in London for a period of time, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, there's the obvious ways in which these environments show up in the fiction. Do you think there are other ways that experiences living in specific places make a mark on your work?
They do inspire me in different ways. Yeah. I mean, there's an issue sometimes if I wanted to set something like in London. I haven't lived in London for so long, and I haven't even been down there in a year. So I'd probably have to do a little bit of online research or something to try and kind of update or set something in the past. But just some stories seem to need to be in a particular place, I guess. I feel the landscape that I live in Scotland. It's very inspiring. I don't know, and I do respond to it a lot. But then some stories need to be set in the city or the suburbs, and place definitely has a lot to do, which I think is why I wasn't very good at generally making up places, the far future or whatever. There's got to be some realistic place. I mean, I have to admit, when George and I were writing Windhaven, of course, it's an invented planet, but it's, it's sea and islands. And I have to say that I found myself living in a place that's a bit like Windhaven, which at the time I was living in. Actually, when we started, I was either in LA or I was in Austin, and George was living in Chicago, and then he later was living in, where was he living, in Iowa or somewhere, and then New Mexico. So, it was all certainly very far from what we were writing about, but also that was a bit different just because it was the two of us, and it was this, neither of us had ever flown. And that was really, one thing that was really quite good was we got a kind of fan letter from someone who was a hang glider, and he wanted to know which one of us was the hang glider. Oh, neither one. And I remember we went up one time, I was in New Mexico, and George took me up this sort of mountain, I guess it was, and he said, "Do you realize this is where hang gliders go off?" And he said, "Can you imagine, one of our characters just kind of like sitting up there? Well, not me. We both kind of scooted back from the edge." That was entirely a work of the imagination.
Have you read anything recently that has particularly excited you?
See, I'm reading a lot for review because I review for The Guardian. So I'm probably reading more fantasy, science fiction, and horror even than if I was just left to my own devices. I did read one thing which I wasn't able to review, and it turned out to be not science fiction at all, is this Polo Stand by Neil Stevenson, who wrote Cryptonomicon. Anyway, his new book, it's not out yet. I think it's out next month. It's called Polo Stand, and it's the first of a trilogy. It's like an adventure, a spy thriller. It has some dribblings of scientific theory, but it's set in the 20s and 30s in America and in Russia. And I just found it completely engaging, but I couldn't review it because it's not really. I mean, he might call it science fiction, but no, anyway, I think someone else is going to review it for The Guardian. And it wasn't that recent, but When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Labatut came out a few years ago. And I just bought his newer book called The Maniac, which I guess came out last year. That's one I really want to read. It's one of those things that combines, it's mostly, people even sometimes refer to it as nonfiction, but it is a novel, but it's a novel of ideas and about real people. What else? These are all books I haven't read yet. What did I like? What do I like? I'm mainly reading stuff I like. I like Deborah Levy, Aaliyah Whiteley. Where's my little book? I write down things that I've read. Oh, The Saint of Bright Doors. How could I forget? That's brilliant. It won the Nebula. It's been nominated for the Ursula Le Guin Award. Didn't win the Hugo, but it was on the final list. First novel, and it's brilliant, really, I thought. And Lake of Darkness by Adam Roberts. There's a science fiction one. That's good too. Well, I've got a stack of books that I have to read in the next few weeks.
Relatable, yeah.
It's the endless queue.
Yes. What would you recommend if I had time to read? Well, when I can, I'm going to read Biography of X. But
yeah, Biography of X, I think you will enjoy based on what I've read of you. Trying to think. I mean, we're much like you, always reading books, but they kind of go out of my head the moment I finish them.
That's why it's good keeping a little list so you can go back. Oh, that was the book I was thinking about. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, have you read anything by Maurice Meyer?
No.
She's a wonderful kind of genre-crossing writer. She's had a few books published with FSG. Her debut novel, The Seventh Mansion, is a sort of, it's like an eco-horror novel, lots of eco-anxiety in it.
Oh, a lot of those.
Yeah, I think you would really like it. It's and her prose is just gorgeous. I'd say she's kind of in the same lineage as Kathy Koja. Yeah. I love Kathy's work as well.
I've just been enjoying the Joyce Carol's writing as Rosamund Smith recently. I mean, those are
Oh,
really
yes.
fun. Her kind of more crime novels,
Yeah.
and it can't go
Yeah.
wrong with a Rosamund Smith book or Joyce
Yeah. Oh,
Carol's in general.
I want to read The Babysitter. That's another one that
Oh,
people
I'm
have
reading that
never read.
now. It's
Oh,
it's
Yeah.
right.
amazing. Oh, it's
It's
amazing.
really good. One of my favorites of hers that I've read, and I've read a lot of hers. So Babysitter,
Yes.
excellent choice. Yeah,
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
dark. Best of luck with your novella, whatever it
turns out to be.
Yeah,
Maybe it'll even
yeah.
be a novel. I don't know.
Yeah.
Probably it won't. I've sort of cut things back. So
Yeah.
we'll see.
Where can our listeners find you?
I'm on Facebook. I've got an author page and I've got my own page. And am I anywhere else? No. Right. Well, thank you. Thank you both.
Thank
That
you.
was very enjoyable.
Thank you.